My world shattered in 8 seconds, a voice crackling through my phone in the middle of a Fort Meade briefing, 1100 miles from home, the quilt is torn. I froze, my laptop's glow blurring, the room's hum fading, my heart knowing before my mind caught up, my mother, Amara Monroe, was gone. I'm Jada Monroe, 38, Deputy Director of U.S. Cyber Command, a black woman who unravels digital threats daily, but nothing braced me for this human cruelty. I left the briefing, my hands shaking, colleagues' questions unanswered, driven by a need to reach Oakland, to understand how my mother, 60, 5'4", a seamstress who wove love into every stitch, could be taken so senselessly. Later, I learned it happened that morning, her stepping out with a quilt square, a 6x6-inch patch of Oakland's history, her copper pendant, 1 ounce, glinting against her faded shawl. She was no threat, her hands full of fabric, not fear, yet Officer Roy Vance, 48, his badge a shield for resentment, stopped his patrol car 30 feet from our gate, barking at her to prove she belonged, on her own property, where she'd lived for 32 years. I see her in my mind, 3 feet from her marigolds, 9 inches tall, saying, "This is my home, sir, 32 years, her voice steady, the way she taught me to face doubt with dignity." But Vance, his eyes narrow, his jaw tight from years of being passed over for promotions he blamed on quotas favoring people like us, didn't hear her. He grabbed her arm, the quilt square falling, threads scattering on the cobblestone path, 2 inches wide, her pendant clinking beside it, and I feel her shock, her strength, holding firm despite the injustice. Vance's partner, Lena Cole, 32, stood 4 feet back, her hand twitching, her face torn. She'd once had a black mentor, a cop who believed in her, and I imagine her heart racing, wanting to speak, but fear kept her silent, a silence that cuts me now, because it's the silence that's let this happen too often. I wasn't there, but I've pieced it from neighbors' whispers, police lies, and the ache in my soul, how my mother, 3 feet from Vance, said, "I have a daughter. I'm no danger," her plea clear, her courage a fire that racism couldn't douse. But Vance, fueled by a decade of unchecked power, 3 incidents buried by no evidence reports, sneered, "Save it, lady," his voice dripping with scorn, as if her blackness was crime enough. He acted, swift and brutal, and my mother fell, her blood staining those marigolds 7 inches away, pooling 15 inches wide, her shawl soaked, her eyes open, searching for me, her Jada, the girl she raised to mend what's broken. I feel the weight of that moment, the rage at a system that let Vance walk free, the grief for every black life dismissed because of skin. A neighbor, Malik, 55, watched from 40 feet, his hands gripping his porch rail, too scared to shout, and I understand his fear, but it stings, knowing my mother stood alone. A teen, Nia, 16, dropped a quilt square she'd sewn with Amara, an 8x8-inch patch of a jazz club, and ran, her sobs echoing, a piece of my mother's legacy left in the dirt. Vance checked her pulse, 20 seconds later, his voice flat, "She's breathing," and told Cole to walk away, to spin a story that my mother, a seamstress who stitched Oakland stories into quilts, had resisted, had threatened him. They drove 1 mile to the precinct, under cold lights, typing a report that called her suspicious, claiming no witnesses, as if her life was a footnote. But a traffic camera, 110 feet away, meant for speeders, caught it all, no sound, but clear, her struggle, her fall, their lie. That footage waited on a server, unseen, while I boarded a plane, my mind replaying our last call, her laugh when I said I'd code a quilt pattern for her, her voice saying, "Jada, you're my thread that holds." I found her journal later, for by 6 inches, in the spilled quilt scraps, a note in her careful script, "If I fall, tell my girl the quilt is torn." She knew the risks of being black in a world that sees us as threats, and her words, her love, fuel me now, though the pain of her foresight breaks my heart. Cole's hesitation, 4 feet from my mother, her eyes flickering with doubt, gives me a sliver of hope she might break free, but her silence chose Vance's lie, and that choice, that complicity, burns. I landed in Oakland, took an SUV to our street, and there she was, 5 feet from where I stood, her body still, the marigolds wilted, her pendant dull in the dirt. I knelt, picked it up, cleaned it with my scarf, it's 1 ounce heavier than my heart, and I felt her lessons to sow truth, her love for the community radio she listened to, her quilts that told Oakland's jazz, protests, joys. I saw Nia's square, the journal, the scattered threads, and knew this was bigger than us. It was every black story erased, every life reduced to a report. I learned Vance's history, 3 assaults hidden by a system that valued his badge over justice, and my resolve hardened, not for vengeance, but for change, for tearing down the lies that let him hurt us. Malik approached, 40 feet away, his eyes wet, muttering, I should have shouted, and I nodded, not blaming, but urging him to speak now. Nia's sobs, 60 feet off, echoed her art, her future tied to my mother's legacy. I held the quilt square, 6 by 6 inches, and vowed to make her truth sing, to use my cyber skills, my power, to expose Vance's cruelty, to ensure no one else falls alone. As Oakland's whispers grew, a radio crackling nearby, I knew this was just the start, a thread pulled, a quilt torn, but one I'd mend with every breath. The days after my mother's death blurred into a haze of grief and fury, but the world didn't pause, it roared awake, and I, Jada Monroe, stood at its edge, clutching her 1 ounce copper pendant, determined to make her truth blaze. I was still in Oakland, 38, my cyber command badge useless against the ache in my chest, when the first spark ignited, for days after Amara Monroe fell, her blood staining the marigold 7 inches away. I hadn't slept, my mind looping her plea. I have a daughter. I'm no danger, and Officer Roy Vance's sneer, his lie that she'd resisted, typed up 1 mile away at the precinct, meant to bury her. But truth, like my mother's quilts, has a way of stitching itself back together. Zara Lee, 27, a city data analyst with a quiet fire, sat 2 miles from our house, scrolling through traffic cam files on a flickering screen. She opened traffic_cam_074_0705_ expecting routine violations, but froze at the 25-second clip. My mother, 3 feet from Vance, her quilt square falling, her body crumpling, blood pooling 15 inches wide. I imagine Zara's breath catching, her hands trembling, not just at the cruelty but at the lie, Vance claiming no witnesses, unaware of the camera 110 feet away. She didn't hesitate, uploading the clip to X with a caption that cut like a blade, Oakland 2025, truth can't hide. By nightfall, it had been viewed 15,000 times, each share a needle pulling my mother's story from the shadows, and I felt her courage in every click, though my heart broke knowing she'd never see it. Vance, 48, heard the whispers at the precinct, 1 mile from our gate, his jaw tightening as X-posts lit up screens around him. I see him now, his resentment festering. Passed over for captain twice, blaming diversity hires like me, his 10-year record of 3 buried complaints a shield he thought unbreakable. He doubled down, telling colleagues my mother moved funny, his voice low, practiced, as if her blackness justified his fear. But fear? No, it was hate, honed by years of unchecked power, and I felt rage bubble in me, not just for him but for a system that let him rewrite lives. Lena Cole, 32, his partner, stood nearby, her eyes darting, her silence from that morning, 4 feet from my mother, haunting her. I learned later she'd visited her old mentor's grave, a black cop who'd believed in her, and I imagine her whispering, I failed, her guilt a crack I hope widens, because guilt can lead to truth. Zara's post spread, and by morning, #Marigold Memory trended, a name born from those blood-stained flowers, 9 inches tall. I saw it first on my phone, notifications pinging as I sat in my mother's kitchen, her sewing machine still, her journal open to, the quilt is torn. The hashtag wasn't just a cry, it was a call, and Oakland answered, painting marigold murals, 10 by 15 feet, on walls in Atlanta, Georgia, and Seattle, Washington, each petal a vow to remember. I felt pride, but also pain, knowing my mother's death sparked this, her life reduced to a symbol when she deserved to live. A youth group, 5 miles away, built a VR exhibit of my mother's sewing room, where she taught kids to stitch Oakland's history, jazz clubs, protests, joy, into quilts. I tried it, slipping on the headset, and there she was, her shawl draped, guiding my hands, her voice saying, "Jada, every stitch holds a story." 500 virtual visitors walked it daily, their tears blurring screens, and I cried too, feeling her love, but also the weight of her absence. A pastor, 70, posted her photo, 4 by 6 inches, from a Sunday when she'd read to his son, captioning it, "She sewed our hearts," shared 40,000 times. I read each comment, strangers calling her Auntie Amara, and I felt her warmth, but also anger at how many only saw her worth after she was gone. Vance, cornered, met his chief at a diner, 3 miles off, insisting the footage was edited, his voice sharp, his hands gripping coffee like a lifeline. I imagine his pulse racing, not from guilt but from fear of exposure, his lies unraveling like a poorly sewn seam. Cole, overhearing, bit her lip, her mentor's words, "Do right, Lena," echoing, and I sense her teetering, her silence a choice she might yet break. The community radio, KOAK, 2 miles away, played a vigil broadcast, voices reading my mother's quilt stories, and I listened, parked outside our house, tears falling as a caller said, "Amara made me feel seen." That radio, I knew, would carry her truth further, a new thread in this fight. Nia, 16, the teen who'd sewn with my mother, painted a mural, 8 by 10 feet, of her holding a quilt, marigolds at her feet, across from our gate. I met her, her eyes red, her voice fierce, she said my art could change things. I hugged her, feeling my mother's spirit, and we started Marigold Mentors, pairing teens with seamstresses to stitch community quilts, a legacy I hadn't planned but needed. Malik, 55, the neighbor who'd watched silently, 40 feet away, joined a healing circle, 1 mile from home, sharing, "I didn't shout for Amara, but I will now." His voice broke, and I forgave him, knowing courage comes late sometimes, but it comes. The circle, 20 people strong, sewed quilt squares, each a story of loss or hope, and I added one, 6 by 6 inches, for my mother, my hands shaking. Vance, seeing murals on his patrol route, slammed his dashboard, muttering, "They're making her a martyr," his hate blinding him to the truth, she was already ours. I learned he'd once roughed up a teen, 16, for looking wrong, a case buried, and my resolve hardened, to expose not just him, but the system that cradled him. Cole, at the precinct, 1 mile away, opened the footage on her phone, her breath hitching, and I pray she speaks, because one voice can shift everything. The movement grew, X posts hitting 60,000 shares, #Marigold Memory a beacon. I spoke at a vigil, 200 feet from our gate, holding my mother's pendant, saying, "She sewed us together, don't let her truth tear." The crowd, 300 strong, held marigold stems, their faces lit by phone screens, and I felt hope, but also fear. Could we outlast the system's weight? A quilt restoration project began, 1 mile away, volunteers mending my mother's works, each stitch a defiance of Vance's lie. I joined, my fingers clumsy, remembering her teaching me, "Jada, a quilt holds when you pull tight." The radio announced it, voices young and old vowing to keep her light alive, and I felt her in every word, but also the challenge ahead. Vance's lies were deep, his allies quiet but real. Nia's mural glowed under streetlights, 60 feet from where my mother fell, and I stood before it, pendant in hand, knowing this was no end, but a beginning. The footage, Zara's courage, the community's roar, they were threads, and I'd weave them into justice, for my mother, for Oakland, for every black life dismissed. As the radio played on, a caller said, "Amara's quilt isn't torn. It's growing," and I nodded, tears falling, ready to pull the next stitch, to burn through every lie until truth stood bare. I stood in my mother's Oakland kitchen, her copper pendant, 1 ounce, warm in my palm, its weight anchoring me as the world spun faster, #Marigold Memory lighting up X with 60,000 shares, my mother's truth no longer buried. I'm Jada Monroe, 38, Deputy Director of U.S. Cyber Command, and though my heart ached for Amara, gone 5 days now, I knew her quilt square, 6 by 6 inches, demanded more than tears, it demanded action. I flew back to Fort Meade, 1,100 miles away, my laptop humming with plans to unravel Officer Roy Vance's lies, his report claiming my mother resisted, typed 1 mile from our gate, a lie now cracked by Zara Lee's footage, viewed 15,000 times. At my desk, screens glowing, I dug into Vance's record, my coding skills slicing through encrypted files like my mother's needle through fabric. I found 3 complaints, assaults on a teen, a grandmother, a vendor. Buried over 10 years, each stamped "no evidence" by a precinct shielding its own. Vance, 48, wasn't just a rogue, he was a symptom, his resentment, born of 2 missed promotions he blamed on diversity, a poison the system let fester. I felt fury, not just at him, but at the silence that let him hurt us, and I vowed to expose it all, my mother's blood on those marigolds, 7 inches away, fueling every keystroke. I launched a digital archive, Amara's Light, a secure platform to collect stories of Oakland's erased, my fingers trembling as I uploaded her journal note, "If I fall, tell my girl the quilt is torn." I wanted her voice, her love, to spark others, and within hours, 50 submissions poured in, each a thread in a quilt I'd weave into justice. Back in Oakland, 2 miles from our house, the community radio, KOAK, aired a town hall, 300 voices packed into a gym, their words crackling through airwaves. Nia, 16, the teen who'd sewn with my mother, spoke, her voice fierce, "Amara taught me every stitch matters, she's why I'm here." I listened, parked outside Fort Meade, tears falling, feeling her art, her 8 by 10-foot mural of my mother, glowing 60 feet from our gate. Malik, 55, the neighbor who'd stayed silent 40 feet away, stood next, saying, "I failed her, but I'm speaking now," his voice raw, and I forgave him again, knowing truth grows in shared pain. A retired judge, Clara Evans, 72, joined, her gavel once feared in Oakland courts, now calling for a civilian review board. I felt hope, but also fear, could we outlast the system's weight? Vance, 1 mile from the precinct, heard the broadcast, his paranoia spiking as colleagues whispered, his hands clenching, imagining edited footage, a lie he told himself to sleep. I learned he'd once coached a youth team, hiding his hate behind smiles, but snapped at a black kid for disrespect, a complaint buried, and I felt sick, seeing how deep his mask went. Lena Cole, 32, his partner, sat in her apartment, 2 miles away, replaying the footage on her phone, her mentor's words. "Do right, Lena," clashing with her silence 4 feet from my mother. I sense her cracking, her guilt a spark I pray ignites, because one voice can shift the tide. The town hall sparked a quilt auction, 1 mile from our gate, volunteers selling restored squares, each 6 by 6 inches, to fund Marigold Mentors, pairing teens with seamstresses. I wired a donation, my heart swelling as Nia texted, "We raised $5,000. I saw my mother in her, her belief that art changes hearts, but also felt the ache of her absence, her shawl no longer draped over her chair. KOAK played bids live, a caller saying, "Amara's quilts hold our history," and I cried, knowing her love lived, but hating the cost. Vance, patrolling 3 miles away, saw a marigold mural, 10 by 15 feet, on a library wall, and swerved, muttering, "They're rewriting me," his hate blinding him to his own guilt. I dug deeper, finding a 4th complaint, a vendor, 50, shoved for loitering, case closed by a retired chief, Raymond Holt, 65, now a consultant. I emailed Clara, asking her to trace Holt's influence, my pulse racing, knowing the system's roots ran deep. Cole, at a precinct meeting, 1 mile off, heard Vance's defense, she moved wrong, and flinched, her hand brushing her badge, her mentor's face in her mind. I imagine her heart pounding, torn between loyalty and truth, and I root for her, because redemption matters. Oakland streets buzzed, 200 feet from our house, teens handing out marigold pins, 1 inch wide, each a nod to #marigold memory. I saw it on X, posts hitting 80,000 shares, Atlanta and Seattle murals joined by one in Chicago, Illinois, 12 by 18 feet. A VR exhibit of my mother's sewing room, 5 miles away, grew to 700 daily visitors, their voices echoing her lessons, and I felt pride, but also pressure. Her truth was mine to carry. Clara met me via video, her eyes sharp, saying, "Holt buried 10 cases, not just Vance's," and I felt the system's weight, but also resolve, my mother's pendant in hand. Vance, at a bar, 3 miles from the precinct, snapped at a rookie questioning the footage, his voice low, "Mind your business," his paranoia a cage tightening. I learned he'd visited his sister, 45, once, confessing a mistake, but blaming the victim, and I felt disgust, seeing his refusal to own his hate. Nia organized a healing circle, 1 mile away, 30 people sewing squares, Malik sharing, "Amara's quilt saved me," and I joined via stream, my voice breaking as I said, "She's still stitching us." The circle's warmth clashed with my fury at Vance, his lies a stain I'd erase. The archive grew, 100 stories, each a black life dismissed, and I coded filters to trace patterns, my mother's journal opened beside me. KOAK announced a radio series, Amara's Threads, airing survivors' tales, and I submitted her note, my voice trembling, wanting her love to reach millions. Vance, hearing it on patrol, 4 miles away, slammed his radio off, his hands shaking, knowing his name trended with #MarigoldMemory. Cole, at her mentor's old desk, 2 miles off, wrote a note, "I saw it all, but hid it," her fear winning, and I ache for her to choose truth, because silence kills. Clara's review board plan gained traction, 500 signatures, 1 mile from City Hall, and I felt hope, but also dread. Holt's allies, quiet but powerful, loomed. The auction raised $10,000, Nia texting, "We're mentoring 20 kids," and I smiled, seeing my mother's legacy, but felt the weight of leading this fight. As X hit 100,000 shares, a Chicago pastor posted, "Amara's light burns in us," and I stood, pendant gleaming, ready to code, to fight, to ensure my mother's quilt, torn but growing, would never fade, her truth a fire no lie could douse. I stood at the edge of a storm I hadn't meant to start, my mother's 1-ounce copper pendant in my hand, its warmth a reminder of Amara Monroe's light, now burning brighter than I ever imagined. I'm Jada Monroe, 38, Deputy Director of U.S. Cyber Command, 1,100 miles from Oakland, where her blood-stained marigold 7 inches away, 6 days ago. #MarigoldMemory had exploded, 100,000 X shares turning my mother's truth into a national cry, her quilt square, 6 by 6 inches, a symbol no precinct lie could bury. I was back in Fort Meade, my screens alive with Amara's Light, the digital archive I'd launched, now holding 200 stories of Black lives dismissed, each a thread in a tapestry I wove for justice. The footage Zara Lee found, 25 seconds of Roy Vance's cruelty, viewed 15,000 times, had sparked murals, 10 by 15 feet, in Atlanta, Chicago, and Seattle, but now Los Angeles, California, and Miami, Florida, joined, each marigold petal a defiance of Vance's claim, typed 1 mile from our gate, that my mother resisted. I felt pride, but also pressure, my mother's journal note, "If I fall, tell my girl the quilt is torn," urging me to lead, though my heart ached for her voice. Vance, 48, was crumbling, his 10-year shield of 3 buried complaints cracking as ex-posts named him, his paranoia driving him to a precinct basement, 1 mile away, where he scoured old files, desperate to rewrite his past. I learned he'd once bragged to a cousin, 40, about handling troublemakers, his hate a badge he wore proudly, and I felt disgust, but also resolve, to end his reign. Oakland's KOAK radio, 2 miles from our house, launched Amara's Threads, a survivor's podcast, airing tales from my archive, 500 listeners nightly. I tuned in, parked outside Fort Meade, tears falling as a woman, 60, said, "Amara's quilt gave me courage." The podcast went national, syndicated in Denver, Colorado, and I felt my mother's love, but also the weight of carrying her legacy. Nia, 16, whose mural glowed 60 feet from our gate, curated a national quilt exhibit, 1 mile away, displaying restored squares, each 6 by 6 inches, in a gallery packed with 400 visitors. I flew to Oakland, stood before her square, an 8 by 8 inch jazz club patch, and whispered, "Mama, they see you," my voice breaking. Malik, 55, the neighbor who'd stayed silent 40 feet away, volunteered, saying, "I owe her this," his hand steady, and I hugged him, feeling community mend what silence broke. Clara Evans, 72, the retired judge, pushed her civilian review board, 1 mile from City Hall, now with 1,000 signatures, and I saw hope, but also danger. Raymond Holt, 65, the retired chief who buried Vance's cases, emailed allies, warning of overreach, his influence a shadow-eyed face. Vance, patrolling 3 miles away, saw a marigold pin, 1 inch wide, on a teen's backpack, and snapped, "Take it off," his voice sharp, his fear of exposure a noose tightening. I felt his hate, but also his weakness, his lies unraveling like a frayed seam. Lena Cole, 32, Vance's partner, stood at a crossroads, 2 miles from the precinct, her note, "I saw it all," burning in her pocket. I learned she'd called her mentor's sister, 50, confessing. I froze 4 feet from Amara, her voice trembling, and I rooted for her, knowing redemption could shift everything. At a precinct meeting, 1 mile away, she faced Vance, his eyes wild, claiming, "They're framing me," but Cole's silence broke. She slipped her note to a rookie, 25, whispering, "Read it." The rookie leaked it, and by noon, X posts hit 200,000, #Marigold memory now a roar. I saw it on my phone, my heart racing, feeling Cole's courage, but also fear. Would she hold? A VR exhibit of my mother's sewing room, 5 miles away, reached 1,000 daily visitors, schools in Portland, Oregon, streaming it, kids saying, "Amara's like my grandma." I cried, feeling her warmth, but also anger at how her death, not her life, sparked this. The quilt auction, 1 mile from our gate, raised $15,000 for Marigold mentors, now training 30 teens. Nia texting, "We're stitching hope." I wired another donation, my mother's shawl in my mind, but felt the burden of leading a movement I hadn't chosen. Vance's arrest came swift, 3 miles from the precinct, Cyber Command agents, my team, cuffing him at dawn, his badge dull, his voice silent, knowing no lie could save him. I watched the feed, 110 feet from his cell, my pendant in hand, feeling justice, but also sorrow, for my mother, for every life he'd scarred. Cole surrendered, 3 hours later, at the California-Nevada border, 80 miles away, her note public, her eyes wet, saying, "I failed Amara, but not anymore." I felt relief, but also pain, knowing her silence had cost us, yet her voice now mended. KOAK aired a vigil, 200 feet from our gate, 500 voices singing a jazz hymn my mother loved, and I joined, my voice cracking, feeling her spirit. A national broadcast, live from Washington, D.C., 300 feet from the Capitol, aired the footage, 10 million viewers, my archive linked, and I spoke, "My mother's quilt binds us, don't let it tear." The crowd, 1,000 strong, held marigold stems, and I felt her light, but also the fight ahead. Holt's allies, 2 miles from City Hall, met quietly, planning to discredit me. Clara's board gained traction, 2,000 signatures, 1 mile away, and I emailed her, "Push harder, my resolve steel." The exhibit toured, stopping in Houston, Texas, 600 visitors, each square a story, and I saw my mother's hands in every stitch, but also the cost, my grief, public now, a weight I carried for millions. Nia's podcast episode, aired on KOAK, 2 miles off, shared her mural story, 10,000 listeners, and I smiled, seeing her grow, but felt the pressure to match her fire. Malik led a healing circle, 1 mile away, 40 people, his square, a 6 by 6 inch protest scene, dedicated to my mother, and I sewed one, my fingers clumsy, whispering, "Mama, I'm trying." Vance, in a cell, 3 miles away, saw a marigold drawing, 8 by 10 inches, taped to a wall, and turned away, his hate a prison he'd built. Cole, free on bail, 1 mile from the precinct, joined a circle, her voice low, I'm sorry, and I forgave, knowing truth needs every thread. As X hit 300,000 shares, a Miami pastor posted, Amara's quilt covers us, and I stood, pendant gleaming, ready to lead, to bind a nation with my mother's torn quilt, her light a fire no shadow could dim. I clutched my mother's 1-ounce copper pendant, its faint glow a beacon in my palm, as the nation wove her truth into something enduring, a tapestry I, Jada Monroe, 38, Deputy Director of U.S. Cyber Command, had never dreamed possible. 8 days after Amara Monroe's blood-stained Oakland's marigolds, 7 inches away, #Marigold memory had surged to 400,000 X shares, her 6x6-inch quilt square a symbol of a reckoning that shook the system. From Fort Meade, 1,100 miles away, I watched Congress, 300 feet from the Capitol, pass the Evidence-Based Suspicion Act, requiring evidence beyond skin color for police action, piloted by 60 academies. My heart swelled with pride, but exhaustion lingered, my mother's journal note, if I fall, tell my girl the quilt is torn, a vow I'd kept, though I ached for her voice. Roy Vance, 48, sat convicted, 3 miles from Oakland's precinct, his 10-year record of 4 buried complaints, assaults on a teen, a grandmother, a vendor, a protester, exposed in a trial viewed by 12 million. I saw his eyes, empty, his hate a cage he'd forged, and learned he'd called his sister, 45, blaming the system, never Amara, and I felt a flicker of pity, but justice burned brighter, her light eclipsing his shadow. Lena Cole, 32, once silent 4 feet from my mother, stood redeemed, 1 mile from the precinct, her confession, I saw it all, a turning point, now training cadets to break silence, her guilt a thread rewoven. I forgave her, my pendant warm, knowing her voice strengthened our quilt. Oakland's KOAK radio, 2 miles from our house, aired Amara's Threads, a national series with 2 million listeners, sharing Amara's Light, my digital archive, now 600 stories strong. I listened, parked outside Fort Meade, tears streaming as a man, 70, said, Amara's quilt gave me hope. A national quilt network, 1 mile from our gate, linked seamstresses in Atlanta, Chicago, and Houston, 15,000 6x6-inch squares stitched. I joined a virtual sew-in, my fingers unsteady, seeing my mother's shawl in their hands, but her absence cut deep, a void no law could fill. Nia, 16, whose mural glowed 60 feet from our gate, led a youth quilt council, 5 miles away, 70 teens crafting patches, her 8x8-inch jazz club square in a museum, and I hugged her, feeling Amara's fire, but also the weight of guiding a legacy. Malik, 55, once frozen 40 feet away, taught at Marigold Mentors, 1 mile off, 90 teens enrolled, his 6x6-inch protest square hung in a school, and I smiled, his courage healing us both. Clara Evans, 72, saw her civilian review board, 1 mile from City Hall, funded, for 1,000 signatures, and I texted her, you're her heart, though Raymond Holt, 65, fled to Tucson, Arizona, his role in shielding Vance exposed, his silence a warning. A National Survivors Summit, 200 feet from Oakland City Hall, drew 700, broadcast on KOAK, 2 miles away, voices from my archive echoing. I spoke, holding my mother's pendant, her quilt holds us. Keep it strong, my voice firm, 15 million watching, but inside, I quaked, missing her laugh. A list of 700 names, 8 by 11 inches, detailing suppressed cases, posted online, 600,000 shares, sparking 12 resignations, including a Miami chief, and I felt justice, but also grief, for each name, a story like Amara's. Zara Lee, 27, whose footage 110 feet away sparked this, ran a data justice lab, 3 miles from the precinct, training 50 analysts, and I funded it, seeing her as Amara's spark, but also my ally. Amara's Read-In, a library event 1 mile away, spread to 2,000 libraries, 2 million readers, and I read her journal, my voice steady, feeling her pride, but also peace, I'd carried her light. The quilt exhibit, in Denver, Colorado, 1,000 visitors, each square a memory, and I walked it online, my mother's patch glowing, but her absence ached, a public grief I bore. Vance's cell, 3 miles away, held a marigold sketch, 6 by 8 inches, ignored, his sister's plea, face it, Roy, unanswered, his hate a dead end. Cole, 1 mile off, taught at an academy, 5 miles away, silence kills, act, her mentor's spirit in her, and I cheered, knowing Amara would nod. Nia's council sent patches, 6 by 6 inches, to 10,000 schools, her text, your mom's smiling, warming me, her youth my hope, but also my challenge. Malik's talk, 1 mile away, drew 300, Amara broke my silence, and I clapped, his path mine too. Clara's board reopened 60 cases, 1 mile from City Hall, exposing Holt's allies, and I felt the system bend, but shadows lingered. The summit's hymn, 200 feet away, 1,000 voices, lifted my mother's jazz tune, and I sang, pendant in hand, her spirit alive, but my resolve fiercer, no quilt would tear again. I returned to Oakland, 60 feet from our gate, house untouched, 3-foot grass, 5-foot fence, marigolds faded, chalk soft, Amara stood here, alone. Teens, 14, left stones, 2 inches wide, carving, 1 stand lights a path, and I knelt, placing my pendant in the soil, 3 feet from cobblestone, whispering, Mama, it's whole. A 4-inch marigold stem stood tall, and I smiled, my grief softening, her light eternal. Koak aired a teen's song, 2 miles away, Amara's quilt shields us, 20,000 listeners, and I drove away, her shawl on my lap, knowing her legacy thrived in Nia's patches, Malik's lessons, Cole's truth. Reflecting, I see my journey, from shattering loss to relentless fight, from rage to hope. I learned truth grows when you refuse silence, that one voice, like Cole's, can mend, that love, like Amara's, outlasts hate, that justice isn't a law, but a quilt stitched by many. If you were in a similar situation, tense, emotional, full of surprises, how would you approach it to achieve the best possible outcome? I left, the marigold stem swaying, Amara's quilt unbroken, a nation standing with her, her light mine forever.